That feeling of your life crumbling around you. What if it's not destruction at all? What if the universe isn't punishing you but preparing you? The ancient alchemists had a phrase for this process. Solve et coagula. Dissolve and recombine. Today, we're going to explore a hidden truth that most people never realize until they're halfway through it. What feels like falling apart is actually the first stage of awakening. Your darkest moments might be the labor pains of your authentic self fighting to be born. If this speaks to something inside you right now, hit subscribe. This channel explores truths others are afraid to say, especially about those moments when your soul is trying to tell you something that your ego doesn't want to hear. There's a particular kind of suffering that comes when your life no longer seems to work. The relationships, career, beliefs, or identity that once defined you start to crumble. You feel lost in a fog of anxiety, depression, confusion, or emptiness. The structures that gave your life meaning suddenly feel hollow or restrictive, and the terrifying part is that you don't know what's supposed to replace them. Carl Jung called this process the night sea journey, a passage through darkness that transforms the voyager. In Eastern traditions, this state is sometimes described as the dark night of the soul. Throughout history and across cultures, these periods of intense disintegration have been recognized not as random suffering, but as necessary transitions in human development. Yet our modern world provides few frameworks for understanding this experience. We're taught to see psychological distress as dysfunction, something to be fixed or medicated away. We're conditioned to believe that happiness is the natural state, and anything else represents failure. So when the inevitable dissolution comes, we panic. We think we're broken. We assume something has gone terribly wrong. But what if nothing has gone wrong at all? What if the anxiety, confusion, and sense of collapse are not signs of failure, but signals that an outdated version of yourself is making way for something more authentic? What if your discomfort is actually growing pains, the natural resistance that occurs when a caterpillar dissolves in the chrysalis before becoming a butterfly? Today, we're going to explore 6 signs that what feels like falling apart is actually awakening. We'll examine the psychological mechanics behind this transformation, drawing from Jung's concept of individuation, mystical wisdom traditions, and modern understandings of consciousness development. Most importantly, we'll discuss how to navigate this terrain with more grace and less fear, transforming what could be traumatic into something deeply meaningful. This isn't about toxic positivity or denying real pain. The dissolution process hurts. It's supposed to, but understanding its purpose changes everything. Chapter 1. The collapse of false identities. The first sign you're not falling apart but awakening is the collapse of identities that never truly belong to you. These are the selves you constructed to please others, to fit in, or to protect yourself from early wounds. Jung described something he called the persona, the social mask we wear to adapt to cultural expectations. The persona isn't inherently bad. It helps us function in society. But problems arise when we mistake this mask for our true face, when we become so identified with our social roles that we lose touch with our deeper nature. Many of us have been playing characters in our own lives for so long that we've forgotten it's a performance. We've become the perfect daughter, the responsible provider, the strong one who never needs help, the intellectual who has all the answers, the spiritual person who's always positive. These identities served purposes. They earned love, approval, safety, or control. But they're ultimately constructions, not your essence. During awakening, these false identities begin to fail. The roles that once brought you praise now feel like prisons. The beliefs that once provided certainty now feel hollow. The relationships built around your persona now feel suffocating. This failure of false identities often manifests as identity confusion. You might find yourself thinking, "I don't even know who I am anymore," or "Everything I believed about myself seems like a lie." This disorientation can be terrifying. Without your familiar self-concept, you feel exposed, vulnerable, adrift. But this identity collapse, painful as it is, creates space for something more authentic to emerge. Jung called this your individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, distinct from collective expectations and conditioned patterns. Consider Mia, a successful corporate lawyer who built her identity around achievement, rational thinking, and never showing weakness. When a health crisis forced her to stop working, her entire sense of self collapsed. She fell into what looked like depression, but it was actually the necessary dissolution of a false identity. As she recovered physically, she discovered parts of herself that had been buried for decades. Her creativity, her emotional sensitivity, her longing for deeper connection. The successful lawyer identity hadn't been wrong, just incomplete. Its temporary collapse allowed her whole self to finally breathe. If you're experiencing this identity confusion right now, try to see it not as a problem to fix, but as a clearing of space. Your psyche is removing what isn't authentically yours, so that what is truly yours can finally emerge. Instead of frantically rebuilding the same structures, allow yourself to rest in the uncertainty. Journal about the roles you've played and which ones feel like costumes rather than expressions of your true nature. Ask yourself, what parts of me have I abandoned to maintain these identities? The collapse of false identities isn't a mistake, it's the beginning of authenticity. Chapter 2. The intensification of emotion and memory. The second sign of awakening rather than breakdown is the sudden surfacing of intense emotions, vivid dreams, and long-forgotten memories. What's happening here is not random emotional chaos, but a necessary purification process. Jung described the personal unconscious as containing what he called complexes, emotionally charged memories, thoughts, and patterns that have been repressed or dissociated. When awakening begins, the boundaries between conscious and unconscious mind become more permeable. Material that's been stored in your psychological basement starts finding its way upstairs. This is why people often report unusual emotional intensity during transformative periods. You might find yourself crying at commercials, furious at minor inconveniences, or overwhelmed by waves of grief that seem to come from nowhere. You might experience anxiety that has no obvious cause or nostalgic longing for places you've never been. Dreams become more frequent and vivid during this time. You might have recurring dreams of houses with hidden rooms, being chased, flying or drowning, all classic symbols of psychological transformation. Pay attention to these dreams. They're messengers from your deeper mind. Memory, too, plays an important role. Long-forgotten incidents from childhood suddenly resurface. You might remember experiences, both beautiful and painful, that have been buried for decades. These aren't random recollections, but pieces of your life story that need integration. This emotional and memory surfacing happens because true awakening requires wholeness. The parts of yourself you've rejected, forgotten, or disowned need to be reclaimed. The emotions you've deemed unacceptable need expression. The stories you've told yourself about your life need revision in light of deeper truth. Alex experienced this during what his doctor called a nervous breakdown in his mid-30s. After his father's death, he was overwhelmed by emotions that seemed completely disproportionate. He had vivid dreams about childhood experiences he'd forgotten. Sometimes he'd be driving and have to pull over because a memory from 20 years ago suddenly felt as present as the moment he was living. His therapist recognized that this wasn't mental illness, but a process Jung would have called abreaction, the release of repressed emotional energy that needed expression. As Alex allowed these emotions and memories rather than fighting them, He discovered that his relationship with his father had shaped his life in ways he'd never recognized. The breakdown was actually his psyche integrating experiences he hadn't been ready to face before. When the process completed, he emerged with a new sense of emotional freedom. If you're experiencing this emotional intensity, resist the urge to numb it through distraction, substances, or excessive busyness. Instead, create safe containers for expression: journaling, body-oriented practices, time in nature, or work with a skilled therapist. Remind yourself that emotions move through the body in about 90 seconds if we don't suppress them. Your feelings won't destroy you, but fighting them might keep you stuck. The rule of psychological transformation is that what you resist persists. What you feel, you can heal. This emotional intensity isn't madness, it's medicine. Chapter 3. The dissolution of certainty. The third sign of awakening is the collapse of certainty. When beliefs, values, and frameworks that once seemed unquestionable suddenly don't hold together. This experience has been recognized across traditions. Zen Buddhism calls it the Great Doubt. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard described it as necessary existential crisis. Jung saw it as part of encountering what he called the numinous, experiences that transcend our existing mental categories. Most of us construct worldviews that provide a sense of safety and predictability. We develop beliefs about how life works, what's important, what's possible or impossible, what happens after death, whether there's meaning or purpose to existence. These frameworks help us navigate reality without being overwhelmed by its complexity. During awakening, these frameworks begin to crack. Questions arise that your existing belief systems can't answer. Experiences occur that don't fit your models of reality. Contradictions become visible where once you saw only consistency. This dissolution of certainty often manifests as existential questioning. You find yourself wondering about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of suffering, whether free will exists, what happens when we die. Questions that once seemed abstract or philosophical suddenly feel urgent and personal. For some, this process involves the painful loss of religious faith. For others, it's the collapse of materialist certainty. Some lose trust in social institutions or political ideologies they once believed in completely. Others question fundamental assumptions about relationships, success, or happiness. This uncertainty can be profoundly disorienting. Without your familiar frameworks, reality itself can feel unstable. You might experience what psychologists call derealization, a sense that the world isn't quite real or that you're watching your life through a veil. But this dissolution of certainty creates the conditions for a more mature relationship with reality. Instead of clinging to rigid beliefs, you develop what Zen traditions call beginner's mind, the capacity to meet each moment freshly, without being trapped in preconceptions. Consider Elena, who was raised in a strict religious tradition that provided clear answers to life's questions. In her early 30s, experiences of suffering that couldn't be explained within her belief system triggered what looked like a crisis of faith. She fell into profound doubt that felt like spiritual abandonment, but as she moved through this painful process, something unexpected happened. She didn't lose her spirituality, it matured. Instead of needing absolute certainty, she developed comfort with mystery. Her faith became more personal, more nuanced, and paradoxically, more resilient because it could accommodate doubt. If you're experiencing this dissolution of certainty, try to cultivate what psychologists call negative capability. The ability to remain in uncertainty without irritably reaching for fact or reason. Instead of grasping for new certainties to replace the old ones, practice sitting with questions. Journal about the beliefs you've outgrown and the questions that now feel alive. Remember that true wisdom often begins not with answers, but with better questions. The collapse of certainty isn't a failure of knowledge, but an invitation to a more profound understanding. Chapter 4. The disruption of external circumstances. The fourth sign of awakening is when external circumstances begin to shift, often dramatically and seemingly beyond your control. Relationships end, careers stall or collapse, living situations change, health challenges emerge, financial stability wavers. From a purely material perspective, these disruptions might seem like random bad luck or poor decisions. But viewed through a deeper lens, they often represent what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that serve your psychological and spiritual development. Many wisdom traditions recognize this pattern. In Hinduism, it's sometimes described as the action of Kali, the goddess who destroys in order to create. Christian mysticism speaks of divine disruption. Modern depth psychology recognizes that the psyche sometimes arranges external circumstances to force internal growth when we've resisted it too long. Why does transformation often require external disruption? Because most of us don't change until we have to. We cling to familiar patterns, relationships and circumstances even when they no longer serve our growth. We accommodate, adapt, and compromise rather than risking the unknown. Sometimes our deeper self arranges a crisis that makes continuing the old way impossible. These disruptions often follow a particular pattern. What you've outgrown begins to fail. The relationship that restricts your authentic expression ends. The career that uses only a fraction of your gifts becomes unbearable. The community that requires your conformity starts to feel suffocating. Jason experienced this when, within a single year, he lost his job. His long-term relationship ended, and health issues forced him to move back to his hometown. At first, he saw these events as catastrophic failures. But gradually, he recognized that his career had been draining his soul for years, his relationship had been emotionally barren, and his fast-paced city life had disconnected him from his values. The external collapses, painful as they were, cleared the way for him to rebuild a life more aligned with his authentic needs. This pattern doesn't mean we should romanticize suffering or that all difficulties are somehow meant to be. Not all suffering is transformative. Sometimes a difficult situation is just a difficult situation. But when multiple areas of life seem to be collapsing simultaneously, especially areas where you've compromised your truth or ignored inner warning signs, awakening may be the deeper dynamic. If you're experiencing this kind of external disruption, try to approach it with what Buddhism calls radical acceptance. This doesn't mean resignation or believing you have no agency. Rather, it means acknowledging what is happening without expending energy on denial or premature attempts to fix everything. Ask yourself, what has this situation made impossible to ignore any longer? What truth is trying to emerge? Sometimes the most transformative question isn't, how do I solve this problem? But what is this problem trying to teach me? Chapter 5. The emergence of synchronicity and meaning. The fifth sign of awakening rather than breakdown is the increase in meaningful coincidences, unexpected connections, and a growing sense that your life is speaking to you through symbols and patterns. Jung coined the term synchronicity for these meaningful coincidences, events that seem causally unrelated but are united by significance. During awakening periods, synchronicities often multiply. You think of someone and they immediately call. You keep seeing the same number patterns. Books fall from shelves open to passages that perfectly address your current struggle. You meet strangers who deliver exactly the message you need to hear. These experiences can be unsettling if you've been operating from a purely materialist worldview. They suggest that reality is more interwoven, more responsive to consciousness than we typically assume. They hint at what physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who worked with Jung, called the radioactive nucleus of physics and psychology, the point where mind and matter reveal their deeper unity. Alongside these external synchronicities, internal meaning-making intensifies. Ordinary experiences suddenly seem charged with symbolic significance. Dreams contain guidance that proves uncannily accurate. You develop what anthropologists call mythic consciousness, the capacity to perceive your personal story as connected to universal patterns and archetypes. This emergence of synchronicity and meaning often manifests as a sense of guidance or direction emerging from chaos. Though you may have lost your old certainties, a different kind of knowing begins to develop, more intuitive, more body-centered, more attuned to subtle signals. Sarah experienced this during what appeared to be a midlife crisis. After months of anxiety and confusion, she began noticing strange coincidences. 3 different people recommended the same obscure book within a week. She kept encountering the symbol of the labyrinth in unexpected places. Dreams offered guidance that proved remarkably practical. At first, she dismissed these as random events or projections of her own psychology. But as they multiplied, she began to sense that something larger was at work, that her life was in conversation with her. As she followed these threads of meaning, she found herself making decisions that looked irrational from the outside, but felt deeply right internally. She left her prestigious but soul-deadening academic position to pursue creative work that had always called to her, but that she dismissed as impractical. What had begun as apparent breakdown revealed itself as breakthrough to a more authentic, meaningful life. If you're experiencing this intensification of synchronicity and meaning, develop practices that help you attune to it. Keep a synchronicity journal to record coincidences and what they might be showing you. Pay attention to recurring symbols, themes, or patterns. Notice which choices bring a sense of energetic rightness, even if they don't make logical sense. Remember that this way of knowing isn't opposed to rationality, but complementary to it. It represents what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to integrate conscious and unconscious, rational and intuitive, material and symbolic ways of engaging with reality. The emergence of synchronicity isn't magical thinking. It's the recognition that meaning flows through all things, waiting for those with eyes to see. Chapter 6. The birth of authentic compassion. The 6th and perhaps most beautiful sign that you're awakening rather than falling apart is the birth of authentic compassion for yourself, for others, and for the human condition itself. This differs profoundly from what we might call performative empathy or conditional care. True compassion emerges not from moral obligation or social expectation, but from the lived recognition of our fundamental interconnection and shared vulnerability. Jung recognized this development in the individuation process. As people integrate their shadow, the disowned aspects of themselves, their capacity for genuine compassion expands. They no longer need to project their unacknowledged qualities onto others through judgment, idealization, or unconscious attraction and repulsion. Many spiritual traditions identify this compassionate awareness as the fruit of transformation. In Buddhism, it's called karuna, the spontaneous response of the awakened heart to suffering. Christian mysticism describes it as agape, love that flows from recognition of essential unity rather than separate selfhood. This birth of authentic compassion often manifests first as self-compassion. The harsh inner critic that once drove you through shame and judgment begins to soften. You develop the capacity to be with your own pain without minimizing or magnifying it. You see your mistakes and limitations with clear eyes, but without the punishing narrative that once accompanied them. From this foundation of self-compassion, your relationship with others transforms. You recognize in them the same struggles, the same longing, the same essential nature as your own. Your capacity to be present with others suffering without trying to fix, advise, or withdraw increases dramatically. You develop what philosopher Martin Buber called I-thou relationship, genuine meeting beyond the utilitarian interactions that dominate much of social life. Michael experienced this shift during what initially appeared to be severe burnout after decades in a helping profession. As he moved through what felt like emotional collapse, something unexpected emerged. The empathy he had always demonstrated professionally, which had been partly motivated by a need to be seen as good and helpful, transformed into something quieter but more authentic. He found himself moved by others' struggles, not because he could fix them, but simply because he recognized our shared humanity. His need to rescue decreased, but his capacity for genuine presence increased. What had felt like compassion, fatigue, revealed itself as an invitation to a more sustainable, authentic way of caring. This compassionate awareness extends beyond individual relationships to encompass larger social and environmental concerns. As separate selfhood relaxes, care for collective well-being emerges naturally rather than from obligation. Many people report that after awakening processes, they find themselves drawn to service or stewardship in ways that feel like natural expressions of who they are, rather than sacrifices or duties. If you're experiencing this birth of compassion, nourish it through practices that support presence and connection. Mindfulness meditation, contemplative prayer, or body-centered awareness practices help sustain this quality of being. Notice when you slip into old patterns of judgment, fixing, or withdrawal, and gently return to compassionate presence. Remember that authentic compassion includes appropriate boundaries and discernment. It doesn't mean allowing harmful behavior or abandoning difficult truths. Rather, it means holding those boundaries and truths within a larger context of care. The birth of authentic compassion isn't sentimental niceness. It's the natural expression of an awakening heart. We've explored 6 signs that what feels like falling apart may actually be awakening: the collapse of false identities, the intensification of emotion and memory, the dissolution of certainty, the disruption of external circumstances, the emergence of synchronicity and meaning, and the birth of authentic compassion. These processes don't always happen in a neat, linear order. They often overlap, recur, and intensify in cycles. The journey is rarely clean or comfortable. It asks everything of us, and yet, those who have traveled this terrain report that they wouldn't trade the wisdom gained, even if they could avoid the suffering it required. If you're in this process right now, remember that the caterpillar doesn't know it's becoming a butterfly. Inside the chrysalis, it experiences what biologists call imaginal discs, cells that contain the blueprint for wings, antennae, and other butterfly structures. To the caterpillar's immune system, these cells appear as threats to be attacked, but eventually they multiply faster than they can be destroyed, and transformation becomes inevitable. Your own imaginal discs might be new insights, creative impulses, authentic emotions, or aspects of yourself that no longer fit your old identity. The parts of you that resist change may initially attack these emerging elements. This is natural. But if you can recognize this resistance without being ruled by it, transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Remember that you're not alone in this process. Throughout human history, people have undergone this passage from false certainty through dissolution to authentic becoming. The mystics, poets, depth psychologists, and wisdom teachers of many traditions have mapped this territory. Their words can be companions when the journey feels too solitary. Most importantly, trust the intelligence of the process itself. What appears as chaos often conceals a deeper order. What feels like darkness may be the shadow cast by a light your eyes haven't yet adjusted to see. What seems like death may be the necessary prelude to rebirth. You're not falling apart. You're awakening to who you've always been, beneath the masks, beyond the stories, and within the heart of your own mysterious life. If this resonated with you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who might be in this process right now. Subscribe to walk deeper with us into the mind, soul, and mystery of what it means to be fully human.